They say real courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the moment you stand your ground when no one else will. In a small-town cafe, one woman made that choice. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a leader. She was just a barista. But when faced with injustice, her voice changed everything. This is the story of Maddie, a woman whose kindness lit a spark that spread across an entire community, proving that sometimes the smallest acts create the loudest echoes of hope. If stories of courage, kindness, and justice touch your heart, I'd love for you to follow, like, and share your thoughts below. Every voice matters, and your support helps keep these stories alive. The morning had started like any other at Freedom Grounds Cafe. Steam curled from mugs, soft chatter filled the air, and the smell of cinnamon muffins clung to the wooden beams overhead. Maddie Crane moved behind the counter with her usual quiet grace, greeting each customer by name, jotting a note in her little black notebook when someone mentioned a birthday or an upcoming deployment. To the people of Rockford, North Carolina, she wasn't just a manager. She was the heart of the cafe, the one who remembered who liked extra cinnamon, who had just lost a son, or who needed a seat near the window for the sake of old war injuries. For Maddie, the cafe wasn't just a job, it was her father's legacy carried forward. Her dad, Sergeant Crane, a retired Marine, often said that places like Freedom Grounds kept men like him alive. That thought alone made her protective of every detail. Every veteran who walked through the door, every service dog that padded loyally beside its owner. That morning, the air outside was crisp with early autumn chill. By 9 o'clock a.m., a familiar figure entered quietly. James Walker, a tall man with a weathered face, moved slowly to his usual corner by the window. His service dog, Duke, a strong German shepherd with a red vest stitched boldly with the words "Do Not Pet," trotted beside him. James rarely spoke more than a polite greeting, but Maddie always made sure his coffee was just right, hot, strong, with a touch of cream. She waved, smiling, and he nodded in return. The cafe carried on in its gentle rhythm until the bell above the door jingled again. This time, the man who entered shifted the atmosphere instantly. Kyle Benson, the new district health inspector, stepped inside in his neatly pressed suit, his clipboard tucked tightly under his arm. He had the sharp-eyed look of a man who measured rooms by their flaws, not their warmth. He scanned the cafe quickly, but his gaze froze the moment he saw Duke curled faithfully at James's feet. His lips pressed thin. He marched toward the counter, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This is a violation," he declared, his words carrying across the room. Conversations halted. Forks clinked against plates. Even the hiss of the espresso machine seemed too loud against the sudden silence. James's hand trembled slightly as it wrapped around his coffee cup. Duke stiffened at his side, sensing the tension. Maddie, calm as ever, stepped forward. "Sir, he's a registered service dog. ADA law protects his right to be here." Benson's cheeks flushed red. "I don't care what kind of dog it is. You're serving food here. It's unsanitary." His tone dripped with authority, as if every syllable were backed by law and power. "It's federal law," Maddie reminded him gently, her voice steady but firm. "You can't just ignore that." The inspector leaned closer, his tone sharp. "I can do whatever I want. This cafe will be cited and shut down unless that animal is removed immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. A mother tightened her hold on her child's hand. Mr. Delaney, nearly deaf and seated near the counter, leaned forward, trying to catch the exchange. James's face had gone pale, his knuckles white as he clutched his mug. Duke pressed tighter against his leg, a living anchor in the rising storm. For a heartbeat, Maddie considered her options. She knew the risk, knew who stood watching, the customers, the staff, and near the pastry display. Susan Hanley, the regional manager who had dropped by unannounced for a routine visit. Maddie could comply, ask James to leave, and protect her job. Or she could stand by what she knew was right. Her voice carried clearly through the cafe. "I won't throw out a veteran and his service dog to make you comfortable, sir." The words struck like a spark in dry tinder. The inspector stiffened, face reddening further. The room held its breath. And then, from the corner, Susan Hanley stormed forward, her heels snapping against the tile. "That's enough," she barked. Her voice was cold, final. "You're fired, Maddie. Clear out your locker, now." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. A customer gasped. Someone dropped a spoon. Even the inspector looked startled at the speed of the decision. Maddie didn't argue. She didn't cry. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied her apron, but her face remained composed. She placed it neatly on the counter, then turned to the young barista at the espresso machine. "Make sure James gets his coffee, okay?" she whispered. And with that, she walked toward the side door, past the stunned faces of her community, past James, who sat frozen in disbelief, past the inspector, who held his clipboard like a weapon suddenly blunted. The door closed softly behind her, but the weight of her absence lingered like a hollow in the chest. The cafe remained suspended in that silence long after she was gone. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering under their breath. James stared down into his cup as though searching for something he couldn't name. Duke laid his head on James's knee, his steady presence the only comfort in that moment. What Maddie didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a young man at the back table had captured the entire confrontation on his phone. The video, shaky but clear, showed Maddie's quiet defiance, the inspector's arrogance, and Susan Hanley's swift, merciless decision. Within minutes, it was uploaded to social media, shared among friends, and spreading like wildfire across town. But inside the cafe, the weight of injustice was still raw. For 6 years, Maddie had built Freedom Grounds into more than a coffee shop. She had remembered names, healed wounds with small acts, created a sanctuary where no veteran had to explain why they flinched at loud noises or why they sat facing the door. And in the span of a single confrontation, all of that was stripped away. The young barista tried to fill the silence, sliding James his coffee as Maddie had asked. "Here you go," she murmured, her voice unsteady. James nodded faintly, but his eyes never left the door Maddie had walked through. He took a slow sip, his hands still trembling. Duke pressed close, steady and faithful, as if guarding not only his handler, but the memory of the woman who had stood her ground for him. Outside, the morning sun shone indifferent on the parking lot. People walked past, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, unaware that within the walls of that modest cafe, a simple act of defiance had set into motion something far larger than anyone could have imagined. For Maddie, walking away with her apron folded in her arms, there was no triumph, only loss. She thought of her father, of the veterans who gathered every Wednesday, of James and Duke. She wondered if she had just thrown away everything she had built. But in her chest, beneath the ache, there was a quiet certainty. She had done the right thing, and sometimes the right thing comes with a pain cost. What Maddie could not see was that across town, a series of engines were rumbling to life, tires rolling out from Camp Barron. And within the hour, the world she thought she had lost would return to her in ways she never dreamed possible. The cafe had never felt so hollow. After Maddie's departure, conversations picked up again, but hushed, fractured, uneasy. The regulars shifted in their seats, stealing glances at James Walker and his service dog. James tried to remain invisible, his shoulders hunched, one hand buried in Duke's fur for steadiness. But silence hung around him like a cloak, the kind that no small talk could pierce. Benson, the inspector, scribbled aggressively on his clipboard, as if the sound of pens scratching against paper could reassert his authority. Susan Hanley, still flushed from her decision, crossed her arms with rigid finality, her jaw set like stone. She thought she had handled a potential violation swiftly and decisively. What she didn't notice was the uneasy shift in the customers' expressions, the quiet disapproval of neighbors who had watched Maddie pour years of kindness into this place. Time crept forward. About 35 minutes later, just as the hum of espresso machines returned to fill the silence, a new sound stirred the air. At first it was faint, a low tremor that could have been mistaken for distant thunder. But as the seconds passed, the vibration grew stronger. Glassware rattled faintly on the shelves. The floor seemed to hum beneath people's feet. Customers glanced at one another, puzzled. Then the sound sharpened. Deep engines growling in unison, tires rolling across asphalt, boots striking pavement in rhythm. The young barista behind the counter froze, cloth in hand. James straightened slightly, his trained senses alert. Through the large front windows, the scene revealed itself. 4 olive-drab Humvees pulled into the parking lot, each one flanked by Marines in immaculate formation. The vehicles moved with deliberate slowness, as if carrying not just soldiers, but gravity itself. Conversations died instantly. The barista's jaw fell open. A child pressed her face to the glass. Even Susan Hanley's composure faltered. When the first Humvee came to a halt, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out who seemed to carry the weight of authority in the very set of his shoulders. Colonel Adam Rutledge, commander of Camp Barron, wore full dress blues. His uniform was precise to the last crease. His chest a quiet constellation of ribbons and medals. He was not especially tall, nor did he raise his voice, but the instant he moved toward the cafe, the atmosphere shifted. Gravity seemed to thicken, drawing every eye to him. The Marines followed in disciplined silence, boots striking the pavement like a heartbeat, measured and steady. By the time the colonel reached the door, more than 20 Marines stood flanking him in solemn formation. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and suddenly everything was different. The room held utterly still as Colonel Rutledge entered. Customers instinctively straightened in their seats, as though drawn to some invisible standard. Even those who had never served recognized the presence of command when they saw it. Rutledge's gaze swept the cafe once, cool and deliberate. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying without effort. "Is James Walker here?" Every head turned toward the corner booth. James, startled, rose slowly to his feet. Duke stood instantly beside him, steady as an anchor. His hands trembled, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Rutledge approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. One Marine still wearing the scars of battle, another carrying the authority of command. Then the colonel raised his right hand in a deliberate, measured salute. James froze. For a long second, he could only stare, as if uncertain what century he stood in, or whether he deserved such recognition. Then slowly his trembling hand rose in return. At once, every Marine in the cafe followed suit. 20 hands lifted in perfect unison, saluting not a superior officer, but one of their own, a man whose battles had not ended when the uniform came off. The silence was absolute. Even Benson, the inspector, stood pale, his clipboard lowered as though it no longer belonged in his hands. Susan Hanley's lips parted, but no words came. The colonel held the salute, eyes steady on James, before lowering his hand with quiet gravity. Then he turned, his gaze settling squarely on Kyle Benson. "You must be Mr. Benson," Rutledge said, voice cool but not raised. Benson swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the weight pressing on him. Yes, sir. I've reviewed your report from this morning." The colonel's words were precise, clipped. Benson stammered. I didn't know he was—" "You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect," Rutledge cut in, his tone not angry but sharp enough to slice. The inspector faltered, his jaw working without words. Customers shifted in their seats, murmurs rippling. Rutledge turned next to Susan Hanley. His gaze pinned her where she stood, rigid as if facing inspection. "I'm told your company has a zero-tolerance policy for staff who defy health codes," he said. "Tell me, do you also have a policy for when your staff uphold federal law and defend a decorated veteran?" Susan's face paled. "Colonel, I wasn't aware you were—" "You watched it happen," he interrupted, his voice as controlled as a drawn blade. "And you fired her anyway." The weight of the words hung heavy. Susan opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no defense. At that moment, the door opened once more. Sergeant Crane, Maddie's father, stepped inside. He wore his old coat, his hair gray at the temples, his posture still carrying the bearing of a Marine even in retirement. He froze at the sight before him, rows of dress blues, the commanding presence of Colonel A. Rutledge, and his community staring in stunned silence. "Colonel," he breathed, recognition dawning. Rutledge's face softened. "Good to see you again, Sergeant Crane." The two men shook hands firmly, their history unspoken but evident. The room seemed to exhale, sensing the bond of old comrades. "What's going on here?" Crane asked, glancing between the Marines and the stew-and-hot faces of cafe staff. Rutledge met his eyes. "We're here for your daughter." The words landed like a thunderclap. A ripple of emotion coursed through the cafe. Customers shifted, some with tears in their eyes. The young barista behind the counter covered her mouth with her hand. Even James's face tightened, his eyes glistening. In that instant, the meaning of Maddie's act became clear. She hadn't just defended James Walker. She had stood for every veteran, every Marine, every man and woman who carried invisible scars. And the Marines had come, not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but to honor the woman who had honored one of their own. As the colonel finished speaking, the cafe door swung again. Outside in the parking lot, a small crowd had erupted. Neighbors, passers-by, even local reporters drawn by the sight of Humvees in front of a coffee shop. Cameras clicked, phones lifted. The story was no longer confined to the walls of Freedom Grounds. It was beginning to ripple outward. But inside, all eyes turned toward the back hallway. Maddie, unaware of the scene unfolding, sat in the staff room with her apron folded in her lap, staring at her name tag. She thought her part in the cafe's story was over. What she didn't yet know was that the real story, the one that would carry her far beyond these walls, was only just beginning. The back room of Freedom Grounds Cafe smelled faintly of cinnamon and old coffee grounds. Maddie sat on the wooden bench, her apron folded neatly across her knees, her eyes fixed on the small rectangle of metal that bore her name. It was ridiculous, she thought, how something so small could suddenly feel like the weight of 6 years of mornings before dawn, of remembering birthdays, of knowing which veteran needed silence and which needed to talk. Her hands shook faintly. She tried to will them still, but the tremor betrayed what her face refused to show. She had not cried when Susan Hanley fired her, nor when she walked out the side door. She had told herself she would not give them that satisfaction. But here, alone, the silence pressed heavy, as if the walls themselves were saying goodbye. A knock at the door startled her. She stiffened, expecting Susan with a cold apology or perhaps another order to leave. "I don't want to hear it," she muttered under her breath. But when the door opened, it wasn't Susan. Colonel Rutledge stepped into the room, his dress blues catching the thin fluorescent light. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone did that. Maddie stood instantly, brushing muffin crumbs from her lap as if she were reporting for duty. "Sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Miss Crane," he replied, his tone gentler than she expected. "I wanted to speak with you personally." She blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I've been following your work here for some time," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Veterans Coffee Hour, service dog support, the little things you've done that most people overlook. You didn't just serve coffee, you served us." Her throat tightened. "I was just doing what felt right. That's why I'm offering you a job." The words struck her like a jolt. "A job? I'm starting a new veteran outreach program at Camp Barron. We need someone who understands not just policies, but people. Someone who knows that healing doesn't always happen in offices or hospitals. Sometimes it happens over a cup of coffee, in a place where you feel safe." Maddie stared at him, stunned. For a moment, she wondered if this was some elaborate attempt to soften the humiliation she had endured. But the colonel's expression was calm, steady, serious. He meant it. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes." A rare smile touched his lips. Before Maddie could respond, the door behind them cracked open again. James Walker stood there, Duke pressed loyally at his side. James's shoulders were stiff, his eyes uncertain. But he stepped forward, voice rough but clear. "She saved me," he said. The colonel turned toward him. "Go on." James swallowed hard, then continued. "That woman didn't just hand me coffee. She gave me a place I could breathe, a place where I wasn't a freak or a broken soldier. She let me sit in silence without judgment. She reminded me I was still human." The room stilled. Maddie's hands trembled again, but this time not from fear. Her eyes glistened as James lowered himself into the chair beside her, Duke's head resting against his leg. The colonel nodded solemnly. "That's exactly what I've been saying." Maddie's voice faltered. "I don't know if I'm enough. I don't have training. I don't have a degree in psychology. You're just what we need," the colonel interrupted gently. "Degrees and policies have their place, but heart is harder to come by, and you've proven you have it. Out in the cafe, voices rose as word spread that Marines filled the parking lot. Neighbors gathered outside, phones raised, reporters scribbling notes. The video of Maddie standing up to Benson had already begun circulating online, spreading through Rockford like wildfire. The cafe had become a stage, and though Maddie didn't yet know it, her story was already bigger than this room. Later that afternoon, she followed Colonel Rutledge through the gates of Camp Barron. The sheer size of the base left her breathless. Long lines of recruits jogging in formation. The echo of drill commands, the sight of flags snapping in the wind. It was another world, a world her father had belonged to and one she had only glimpsed from the outside. Inside the headquarters, she met the team that would soon become her circle. Therapists who specialized in PTSD, social workers trained in transition assistance, and most moving of all, veterans themselves who now served as mentors. Chief Petty Officer Brian Stone, a retired Navy corpsman with a prosthetic leg, shook her hand firmly. His cane bore an eagle carved into the handle, worn smooth from use. "So you're the coffee lady," he said with a grin. "Guilty," Maddie admitted, smiling faintly. "I've had vets talk more about your cafe than their own families," he chuckled. "That says something. You got something rare, Miss Crane. You listen. That matters more than any title." He introduced her to 3 veterans waiting to be paired with service dogs. One, a young woman named Amber, sat quietly with burn scars visible down her neck and arms. She hadn't spoken in weeks, they told Maddie. But when Amber saw her, recognition flickered in her eyes. "I know you, Paul," she said softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You're the girl from the video." Maddie knelt beside her, touched and humbled. "I'm just a regular person who made some noise," she said gently. "But I'm really glad you're here." Amber hesitated, then pointed to the German shepherd lying near her cot. "Her name's Nova. They say she's mine. I don't know if I deserve her." "You do," Maddie said instantly. Her voice carried no doubt. "You absolutely do." Amber's lips trembled, but for the first time in months, she smiled. That evening, Maddie sat in her small apartment with his silver star James had given her earlier that day. He had slipped it into her hand without ceremony, only a quiet note inside the box. "Because you showed me what courage looks like." She turned the medal over in her hands again and again, the weight both foreign and humbling. She hadn't stormed a battlefield. She hadn't dragged comrades through gunfire. All she had done was refuse to send a man and his service dog away. But somehow that had been enough for James to hand her one of the military's highest honors. Her phone buzzed. Lena, her fellow barista, sent a message. "Freedom Grounds isn't the same without you. Come back, please." Maddie stared at the words. Her chest ached with longing. The cafe had been her world. But now, after what she had seen at Camp Barron, after Amber's quiet smile, she wondered if her world was shifting into something bigger. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office across town, Kyle Benson replayed the video of his confrontation on a glowing computer screen. Again and again, he watched himself bark orders, watched Maddie defy him, watched the colonel enter with his Marines. Each replay deepened the humiliation. "She made me look like a fool," he muttered. A knock at his door made him jump. A tall man in a gray suit entered, wearing a gold pin on his lapel, an eagle gripping arrows. "I'm with Internal Affairs," the man said calmly. "We need to talk about your conduct." Benson's face drained of color. For the first time, he realized that the storm he had started might not end with Maddie. It might come crashing down on him. And while Benson's world began to unravel, Maddie's was only beginning to expand. She had defended a veteran, and now the Marines were offering her a new mission, one she never expected, one that would test not her strength, but her heart. The first morning at Camp Barron's Outreach Center was quieter than Maddie expected. The long wooden table in the main room had been polished until it gleamed, and chairs stood neatly in a circle. A coffee pot burbled on the counter, filling the space with a familiar aroma. Maddie had arranged everything herself, placing mugs within easy reach, setting out muffins she'd baked before dawn, making sure the room felt warm instead of clinical. When the first veterans trickled in, their steps were cautious, guarded. Some walked with canes, others with service dogs close by their side. A few avoided eye contact altogether, scanning exits instinctively. Maddie recognized the look. She'd seen it in James Walker countless times, the quiet readiness of someone who never fully left the battlefield. She greeted each person with the same care she once used at the cafe. A smile, a nod, a soft, "Glad you're here." No clipboard, no intake forms, just welcome. James arrived last, as usual, Duke padding steady at his side. He hesitated at the doorway, scanning the circle of chairs. Maddie met his eyes and nodded toward an empty seat. Slowly he settled in, his hand resting on Duke's collar. The session began without fanfare. No speeches, no therapists leading from a podium. Just people sitting together in a circle, waiting. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, unexpectedly, James stood. "I don't know why I'm standing," he said, his voice low, uncertain. "I've never talked about this out loud." Maddie didn't move. She simply listened, giving him space. James drew a shaky breath. It was 2009, Kandahar, Operation Hunter Field. Our convoy hit an IED. The Humvee behind us went up first. 3 guys inside. One was gone instantly. The other 2, they were screaming. His voice cracked. "I ran in anyway. Shrapnel hit me, burned my hands. I lost 2 fingers, but I pulled one of them out." He swallowed hard. "The third guy, he was trapped. I got him free, but everything went dark." The room was silent. No one shifted. No one interrupted. "When I woke up," James continued, "they told me I earned a silver star, but they didn't tell me how to live with it. They didn't tell me how to sleep without hearing those screams. They didn't tell me how to walk into a room without feeling like I didn't belong." Maddie rose quietly, walked to the coffee pot, and began pouring. It wasn't a distraction. It was her way of giving him a breath, a pause without breaking his flow. James's eyes lifted to her. "2 years ago, I couldn't walk into a place like this. I couldn't sit among strangers. Duke helped. But Maddie," his voice softened, "she gave me a place to heal. She never asked questions. She just treated me like I mattered." Maddie froze, coffee pot in hand. Her throat tightened, but she kept her gaze steady. Amber, the young woman with burned scars, leaned forward for the first time since she'd arrived. Her hand reached across the table, resting lightly on James's arm. Her voice was a whisper, fragile but audible. "Thank you." It was the first word she had spoken in weeks. The room shifted in that instant. The veterans weren't just patients or case files. They were people breaking open in small, tentative ways, helped not by formality, but by the presence of others who understood. After the session, Maddie sat in Colonel Rutledge's office, the weight of the morning still heavy on her. The colonel paced by the window, phone pressed to his ear. His tone was clipped, measured. "Yes, understood? No, she hasn't accepted yet. I'll speak with her again." When he hung up, his gaze found Maddie. "They want to offer you a national role," he said without preamble. Maddie blinked. "What kind of role?" "Director of Community Veteran Initiatives. You'd be traveling, building outreach programs like this across the country, speaking to leaders, shaping policy." Her breath caught. The title sounded monumental, far beyond anything she imagined for herself. "And if I say no, then you stay here," Rutledge said. "Keep doing what you're doing. We'll support you either way." Maddie sank into a chair. "I didn't sign up for any of this." "No," the colonel agreed, "but you earned it." Her eyes drifted to the framed photograph on his desk, a younger Rutledge standing in muddy fatigues, arms slung around fellow Marines. "Can I be honest?" she asked. "Always." "I don't want to become a symbol," Maddie admitted. "I just want to keep doing good work." The colonel studied her for a moment. "Maybe that's exactly why they need you." That night, Maddie called her father. His voice came warm and crackling through the receiver. "Hey, kiddo, settling in?" "Sort of," she said, biting her lip. "Dad, did you ever feel like you were part of something bigger than yourself?" He chuckled softly. "Every damn time I put on that uniform. Even when it was hard. Especially then." Maddie swallowed the lump in her throat. "I've got a choice to make." "I know you'll make the right one," her father said simply. The following Wednesday, the outreach center overflowed. Word had spread about James's testimony. Veterans who had never stepped into a group before arrived. Some drove in from counties away. The wooden chairs filled quickly, and extra seats had to be pulled in. The walls bore new photographs, smiling faces, service dogs, veterans laughing together. Maddie stood at the front, nerves humming. She glanced around at the faces, young, old, scarred, weary. Each one carried a story. Each one had come because they had heard something was happening here. She took a deep breath. "I've been offered something big," she said, her voice steady. "But honestly, nothing feels more important than this. This room, you, what we're building here together." The silence broke with applause, soft at first, then swelling until the room filled with clapping hands and misty eyes. Colonel Rutledge stood at the back, arms crossed, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Maddie had chosen, and her choice was clear. She belonged here. But across town, in a sterile office, Kyle Benson stared at a new report dropped on his desk. The words at the top cut through him like a blade. "Conduct unbecoming of a public officer." His hands shook as he read. He had tried to bring Maddie down, and now the walls were closing in on him. The program he sought to discredit was thriving. The community he dismissed was standing stronger than ever. And for Maddie, what began as a small circle of chairs and a pot of coffee was becoming a movement, one that no inspector's pen could erase. Autumn mornings at Camp Barron's Outreach Center usually began with laughter echoing in the hallways, the rustle of service dogs shaking off sleep, and the hiss of coffee being poured into mismatched mugs. But on the morning the inspectors arrived, the atmosphere felt different, heavy, expectant. Three individuals stepped out of a government sedan, two men in sharp gray suits and one woman with her hair pulled tightly into a bun. They carried clipboards, pens, and expressions that suggested they were here to find flaws, not fellowship. Maddie stood at the entrance, a smile fixed on her face, but she felt her stomach tighten. "Good morning," she greeted them. The taller man barely nodded. "We're here to evaluate compliance with federal standards," he said crisply. "Of course," Maddie replied. "Right this way." They walked the halls like judges surveying a courtroom. Every corner, every detail came under scrutiny. One bent to check the kitchen floor for stray crumbs. Another opened filing cabinets, flipping through therapy logs as though they held state secrets. The woman crouched by the kennels, inspecting food bowls, measuring the space. Finally, one of them turned to Maddie. "What certifications do you hold to run a therapeutic support group?" She hesitated. "None," she admitted, her voice even. "Just kindness and consistency." The inspector's pen scratched across his clipboard. He didn't smile. Word spread quickly among the veterans. By evening, the usual sense of ease had evaporated. Men and women who had once leaned on each other for strength now sat stiffly, glancing at the inspectors who scribbled notes in the corner. Whispers rippled. "They're going to shut it down." James Walker sat quietly in his usual chair, Duke's head heavy against his leg. His face was carved with tension. For weeks he had opened himself in ways he never thought possible, only to feel the ground shifting beneath him again. Maddie refused to let fear silence them. The next morning she requested a full meeting. Veterans, volunteers, staff, even the inspectors were invited. By 8 o'clock the conference hall was filled. The air buzzed with unease. Maddie stood at the front wearing her usual jeans and boots, a t-shirt that read, "Support those who serve." Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them on the table before her. "I know why you're here," she began, her voice calm, "and I know what some people want you to find. But before you decide anything, I want you to hear directly from the people this program has helped." She turned toward James. "Would you speak again?" James stiffened, surprised. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Then he rose slowly to his feet. "When I first came here," he said, his voice low but clear, "I thought I didn't deserve help. I thought I had to earn it, and I couldn't. But Maddie showed me I didn't need to. I just needed to accept it. She gave me a place where I wasn't broken, where I wasn't a burden. She gave me back my humanity." He gestured toward Amber. "And she gave her a voice." Amber, her scars visible but her eyes shining, stood next. "I hadn't spoken in 2 months before I met her, but she looked at me like I wasn't ruined. She made me believe Nova, my service dog, wasn't a gift I had to deserve. It was something I needed, and for the first time I smiled again." Tears welled in Maddie's eyes, but she remained still, letting their words stand. Then one by one others rose. An older veteran leaned heavily on his cane. I came here because I was tired of drinking myself to sleep. Now I come because I finally found people who understand. A young amputee's hand shook as he stood. I thought losing my leg meant losing my family, but I found a new one here. Another Marine admitted, voice cracking, I hadn't spoken to my kids in 6 years until last week. This place gave me the courage to pick up the phone. They didn't shout. They didn't plead. They just stood, steady and resolute, like soldiers answering roll call. And their silence between testimonies was louder than any speech. The inspectors sat stiffly at their table, pens hovering, eyes darting from face to face. By the time the last veteran spoke, the hall was thick with emotion. No report could capture what had unfolded there. That night, Maddie was called into Colonel Rutledge's office. He stood with arms crossed as the lead inspector entered, his clipboard tucked under one arm. We've reviewed every file, the inspector began. We've observed every session. And what we saw today was not simply a program. It was a community. Maddie's breath caught. We'll be recommending Camp Barron's Outreach Center as a national model, the inspector continued. We've never seen anything like it. Relief crashed over her like a wave. For the first time since their arrival, she exhaled fully, but the inspector wasn't finished. He handed her a folder. One more thing. You are being nominated for a civilian commendation for service to national veteran welfare. Maddie opened the folder and her hands trembled. At the bottom of the form was a signature. Secretary of Defense. She looked up, speechless. Colonel Rutledge allowed himself the faintest smile. Looks like you're official now. Across town, Kyle Benson sat in his dark office, his once pristine desk cluttered with papers he no longer cared to organize. A letter lay before him. Resignation accepted. His career, undone by his own arrogance. He had tried to bury Maddie under rules and citations, but instead he had been the one buried under scrutiny. At the outreach center, the veterans gathered the next morning as usual, but this time with a renewed sense of belonging. Someone had painted a new sign to hang above the coffee station. The words were simple. No rank here, just respect. When Maddie saw it, her throat tightened. That phrase captured everything she hoped to build. Not hierarchy, not inspection, but dignity. She pinned the commendation folder to the wall beside the photographs of veterans and their dogs. Not to boast, but to remind everyone that what they had created together had been recognized at the highest level. The community they had built had survived its first trial, and not only survived, it had triumphed. That night, as Maddie locked up the center, she stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The stars above Camp Barron glittered sharp and endless. She thought of James, Amber, the older vets, the young recruits who peeked into the sessions with quiet curiosity. She thought of her father, who had once told her that sometimes silence was the strongest answer. And she thought of the future, not just of Camp Barron, but of the towns and cities that might one day build their own circles of chairs, their own coffee stations, their own safe havens. The storm had passed, but Maddie knew storms always returned. Still, now she carried the certainty that when they did, this community would weather them together. What had begun as a small act of defiance in a café had grown into something unshakable. A family built not by blood or rank, but by trust. And for the first time, Maddie believed in her heart that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The envelope was a deep navy blue, sealed with the crest of the Department of Defense. Maddie found it waiting for her on the desk in Colonel Rutledge's office. Her name was written neatly across the front, with a small handwritten note at the bottom. Your story has become our story. Will you come speak for all of us? The invitation was to the National Veterans Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C., a gathering of commanders, officials, advocates, and representatives from across the country. Maddie's throat tightened as she read. She hated stages. She hated attention. She was comfortable pouring coffee and remembering birthdays, not standing behind podiums with cameras flashing. But when she showed the letter to Amber, the young woman with burn scars, Amber's hand closed tightly around hers. You speak for all of us, she whispered. That simple plea settled it. Maddie would go, not for herself, but for them. The day of the conference dawned gray and cold. The marble buildings of Washington loomed in mist, their steps slick with rain. Maddie stood at the base of the Capitol, clutching the speech folded in her pocket. She wore a navy blazer over jeans, refusing to dress like someone she wasn't. Her stomach churned. "Need a ride, Miss Crane?" She turned. James Walker stood behind her, dressed in full marine blues, every ribbon polished, every crease sharp. Duke trotted proudly at his side, tail wagging as if he knew this was something important. "James," Maddie breathed, relief washing over her. "The base assigned me as your escort," he explained, though his small smirk betrayed pride. She laughed nervously. "You clean up nice." "You're the one about to speak to the Pentagon," he replied. Her smile faded. "I'm not ready." "Yes, you are." His gaze steadied hers. "Remember what you always said to me? Just be human. That's enough." They walked together through security lines, past reporters, into echoing marble halls. Inside the chamber, hundreds of people filled the seats. Generals in uniform, advocates in suits, veterans wearing pins and patches from decades of service. Cameras blinked. Murmurs filled the air. On stage, a podium waited, her name printed in bold letters across the front. Maddie's hands trembled as she stepped forward. She gripped the microphone. The room fell silent. "I'm not a doctor," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not a general. I'm not anyone special, really. I manage a small coffee shop near a Marine base." A ripple of chuckles passed through the crowd. "I knew every regular's order. I kept a notebook behind the counter with reminders like, 'Steve likes extra cinnamon,' or 'Don't ask about deployments, just offer a smile.'" Her throat tightened. She paused, breathing. "What I learned is this: veterans don't always need grand speeches or perfect policies. Sometimes they just need a place where they're seen, remembered, and respected. A place where no one asks why they sit facing the door or why they bring a dog inside. A place where silence is accepted and kindness is given freely." The chamber was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. "My father was a Marine," she continued. "He came back different, quieter. I didn't understand it when I was little. I thought maybe he didn't love us anymore. One night I found him sitting on the porch, staring at nothing, holding his service pistol. I didn't say anything. I just sat with him. Hours passed. Finally, he put the gun down. He looked at me and said, 'Thank you for not leaving.'" Gasps rippled through the audience. Maddie's tears slipped free, but she kept her voice steady. "So, no, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a soldier. I'm just someone who stayed, someone who listened, someone who poured coffee and remembered birthdays. And I will never stop doing that." The applause began as a wave, then rose like thunder, rolling through the chamber. Generals stood. Veterans wiped their eyes. James, in his dress blues, stood tall with Duke beside him, his salute sharp and proud. That evening, Maddie slipped out into the cool Washington night, the conference fading behind her. She needed air. She needed silence. An older man approached, his beard white, his hands rough and weathered. He wore gold-rimmed glasses that caught the light. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked gently. Maddie tilted her head. "Should I?" He pulled a photo from his pocket, yellowed with age. It showed a much younger Maddie, smiling as she handed a sandwich to a disheveled man wearing a green beanie outside the cafe. "That was me," he said. "You gave me lunch every Wednesday for months. I was homeless. I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 10 years. I didn't think I deserved a second chance, but now I do. And that's because of you." Maddie's breath caught. "You were the one with the beanie." He nodded, pressing something into her hand. It was a small silver pin, shaped like an eagle's wing. "I wore this when I rejoined my family. It's yours now." Tears blurred her vision. When she looked up again, the man was already walking away. That night, back in her hotel room, Maddie sat on the windowsill, the pin in her palm. For the first time in weeks, she felt quiet. Not empty, not overwhelmed, just quiet. And in that quiet, something new bloomed. Peace. When her plane landed back in North Carolina, Maddie bypassed her apartment and drove straight to Freedom Grounds Cafe. The creaky door opened to the familiar scent of cinnamon and coffee. Lena stood behind the counter, eyes widening. "You're supposed to be famous now," Lena teased. "I'm just here for coffee," Maddie smiled. But as she looked around, she noticed new photos on the wall. Amber with Nova, James with Duke, groups of veterans laughing together. The cafe had changed because she had changed it. A week later at Camp Barron's annual Veterans Day ceremony, the crowd was larger than ever. Soldiers ferried elderly veterans in golf carts. Children sang the anthem. Families gathered with flags. At the center of it all stood a new statue, not a soldier or a general, but a woman kneeling with a coffee cup beside a service dog. 5 words were engraved at the base: kindness, courage, community, coffee, home. Maddie stood in the back, stunned. Colonel Rutledge stepped beside her. "We figured it was time to honor the real hero," he said. Tears stung her eyes. "I didn't do anything special." "Exactly," he replied softly. As the ceremony ended, veterans and families lined up, not to salute, not to ask questions, but simply to hug her, one by one. No words, just gratitude. That evening, Maddie returned to the outreach center. The rooms were quiet now, the wall of photos overflowing with memories. She pulled one last picture from her bag, a photo of her as a child, sitting on her father's lap, both holding tiny American flags. She pinned it to the center of the wall. Beneath it, she taped a note in her own handwriting. "He served the country. I served the ones who came home." She turned off the lights, stepping into the cool evening. Outside, veterans gathered around a fire pit, their laughter echoing. Maddie knew now that what she had built wasn't hers alone. It belonged to all of them. And as the wind rustled through the trees, she could almost hear a whisper carried on the night air. "Thank you, Maddie." Her story was no longer just hers. It was theirs, and it would never be forgotten. Maddie's journey began with a single act of defiance, refusing to send a veteran and his service dog away. That act cost her a job but gave her something greater: a mission. Through kindness, courage, and listening, she built a community stronger than bureaucracy, stronger than politics, stronger than fear. Her story reminds us that heroes aren't always the ones with medals. Sometimes they're the ones who pour coffee, remember birthdays, and refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. If this story touched your heart, share it. Follow along. And keep the spirit of kindness alive. Because somewhere out there, someone is